No piece of land in American history has produced a more sustained, more documented, and more institutionally significant body of anomalous evidence than a 772-acre cattle ranch in the Uinta Basin of northeastern Utah. This is not a story about ghost sightings or campfire legends. It is a story about government programs, scientific investigations, physical evidence, and a property that has been actively resisting human understanding for longer than any living person has been keeping records. Stay until the end, because this is the complete history of Skinwalker Ranch. The story of Skinwalker Ranch does not begin in 1994 when a Utah cattle ranching family drove through the front gate for the first time and began experiencing things that would eventually force them to abandon everything they had built. It does not begin in 1996 when a Las Vegas aerospace entrepreneur purchased the property and installed a scientific research team on its grounds. It does not begin with any Western document, any government program, or any television broadcast. It begins in the deep time of the Uinta Basin itself, in a geological and human history that extends back thousands of years before any of the modern actors in this story were born, and in an indigenous knowledge tradition that treated what this land produces not as a mystery to be solved, but as a permanent feature of the natural world, to be respected, navigated, and in certain circumstances avoided entirely. The Uinta Basin occupies a vast section of northeastern Utah, bounded by the Uinta Mountains to the north and the Book Cliffs to the south, covering approximately 4,500 square miles of high desert terrain whose geological character is unlike anything in the surrounding landscape. The basin sits atop one of the most unusual sedimentary formations in the American West, a layered geological record whose composition and structural characteristics have produced anomalies in magnetic field readings, water table behavior, and electromagnetic environment that have been noted by scientists working in the area without ever being satisfactorily explained by the standard geological models applied to comparable formations elsewhere in the region. This geological unusualness is not peripheral to the story of Skinwalker Ranch. It is the physical substrate on which everything the ranch has produced across its documented history rests. The Ute people, the Nutsu, the people, have maintained their connection to the Uinta Basin across a span of time that Western historical record cannot fully capture. Their presence in the basin predates every documentary source available to outside researchers by centuries, and their accumulated knowledge of the land they inhabited reflects a depth of observational history that no scientific investigation program has yet been able to match in either duration or intimacy. Within that accumulated knowledge, the specific area that would become Skinwalker Ranch occupied a category of particular significance, not as a sacred site in the sense of a location designated for ceremonial purposes, but as what the Ute traditions consistently describe as a place of danger, a location where the ordinary rules governing the relationship between the human world and whatever exists alongside it did not apply in the way they applied everywhere else. The concept of the Skinwalker in Ute tradition, Yenaldlushi in the related Navajo tradition from which the English term is most commonly derived, refers to a specific class of entity capable of moving between the human world and other states of existence, associated with the exercise of power that operates outside the normal boundaries of the physical world. The designation of this property as a path of the Skinwalker, the corridor along which these entities moved, was not a metaphorical or decorative element of the Ute cultural relationship to the land. It was a practical description of what the area produced, and a behavioral instruction about how to relate to it. The Ute maintained specific protocols about this territory. They did not build permanent structures within it. They did not graze livestock on it for extended periods. They did not camp on it overnight when alternatives were available. And they advised against it consistently enough that the tradition persisted intact across generations whose contact with the specific land was intermittent rather than continuous. The archaeological record of the Uinta Basin provides a partial corroboration of the Ute traditions that is more significant than it might initially appear. The basin contains evidence of human habitation extending back at least 12,000 years, with continuous occupation across multiple distinct cultural periods documented through artifact assemblages and structural remains at numerous sites across the region. What the archaeological record for the specific area of the ranch and its immediate surroundings does not contain is evidence of the kind of sustained, intensive habitation that the basin's resources would typically have supported. Sites in comparable terrain elsewhere in the basin show evidence of extended occupation, the material accumulation of communities that return to the same locations across multiple generations because the resources and conditions favored sustained presence. The Skinwalker Ranch area does not show that pattern. The evidence suggests passing through rather than settling. Use of the area's resources without the kind of sustained investment in place that the broader human history of the basin produced everywhere else. Whether that pattern reflects the Ute behavioral protocols about the land, or reflects something more direct about what the land produced for people who spent extended time on it, is a question the archaeological record poses without answering. What it establishes is that the avoidance of this specific territory has a human history that is significantly older than any Western account of the property's strangeness. The first Western settlers to move through the Uinta Basin in significant numbers arrived in the latter half of the 19th century, drawn by the same combination of agricultural potential and mineral resource surveys that drove settlement across the American West in the post-Civil War period. The basin's river systems, particularly the Green River and its tributaries, supported the agricultural operations that the first ranching families established in the region, and the area that would become Uinta County attracted a wave of settlement beginning in the 1880s that produced the first documentary record of anomalous activity in the region generated by observers operating outside the Ute cultural framework. What those early settlers documented was not organized or systematic. It was the accumulated record of individual encounters and observations recorded in personal correspondence, local newspaper accounts, and the oral histories preserved within the settler families whose descendants still populate parts of the region. None of it was produced with any awareness that it was contributing to a body of evidence that researchers a century later would be treating as significant. It was simply people recording what they had seen and experienced in a landscape that consistently produced things they could not explain. The livestock losses that the earliest ranching families documented in the area corresponding to what would become Skinwalker Ranch share characteristics with the mutilation cases that would be systematically documented a century later and that remain unexplained today. The accounts preserved in the historical record describe cattle and horses found dead in the field with injuries that the ranchers found impossible to attribute to any predator they had encountered. Wounds whose precision and whose apparent absence of surrounding disturbance seemed inconsistent with any animal attack they had knowledge of. The early settler accounts do not use the language of surgical precision that later veterinary analysis would apply to comparable cases, but the behavioral descriptions they contain point toward the same pattern. No blood on the ground around the carcass. Specific body parts missing in a manner that seemed targeted rather than random. The animals in the surrounding herd showing unusual behavioral disturbance, refusal to approach the area where the dead animal was found, sustained distress without identifiable cause, that persisted for days after the removal of the carcass. The aerial accounts from the early settler period are the most culturally striking element of the 19th century documentary record for this region, because the observers producing those accounts had no cultural framework within which to interpret what they were seeing other than the religious and folkloric traditions of their backgrounds, and those frameworks produced descriptions that are both clearly inadequate to what was being observed and clearly pointing at something real. Balls of light moving through the night sky above the basin in patterns that the observers could not attribute to natural sources. Objects of indeterminate shape and significant apparent size moving in ways that violated the behavioral characteristics of every aerial phenomenon the settlers had prior experience with. Multiple independent observers on separate properties across the basin producing accounts of the same phenomenon on the same night without any mechanism for coordination, a consistency that emerges from the historical record without any contemporary awareness among the observers that their experiences were shared. The early 20th century deepened this record without organizing it. The settlers of the first generation gave way to their children and grandchildren, and the accounts of anomalous activity in the basin's most active area continued accumulating in the same informal, uncoordinated documentary channels, personal letters, local journalism, family oral histories, across the decades leading up to the modern investigation period. No outside institution took notice. No researcher organized the scattered accounts into a coherent evidential picture. The record simply grew, decade by decade, in the archives and the memories of a rural community whose relationship to the strangeness of this particular stretch of their landscape had become as ordinary as its weather, noted, discussed privately, and never quite explained. What the accumulated 19th and early 20th century record establishes for the subsequent history of Skinwalker Ranch is not proof of any specific phenomenon. It is continuity. The same categories of activity: aerial phenomenon, livestock losses with anomalous characteristics, physical encounters that observers found impossible to account for within their existing frameworks, appear in the record across a span of more than a century before the Sherman family ever drove through the front gate. The Sherman family's experience, the NIDS research, the Pentagon's classified investigation, and the current broadcast investigation are all chapters in a story whose first pages were written long before any of the modern participants arrived. That continuity is the most important contextual fact the early record provides. Terry and Gwen Sherman were not people who came to Skinwalker Ranch looking for a paranormal experience. They were a working ranch family from Utah who had spent years looking for the right property to expand their cattle operation, and when they found the 772-acre parcel in the Uinta Basin in 1994, what attracted them was exactly what a cattle ranching family would evaluate: the acreage, the water access, the existing structures, and the potential for sustainable agricultural operation. The purchase price was below market rate for comparable properties in the region. The sellers, a family who had owned the property for decades, stipulated in the sale agreement that nothing on the property was to be moved or modified, a clause unusual enough to register but not unusual enough in the excitement of the purchase to give the Shermans significant pause. They moved onto the property in March of 1994. The anomalous activity began within days of their arrival. The first incidents were strange but individually explainable within ordinary frameworks: tools missing from where they had been left the previous evening, animals behaving with unusual wariness in specific areas of the property without any identifiable cause. The feeling, reported by multiple family members independently, of being watched from the tree lines and ridge lines surrounding the ranch house, even when visual inspection of those areas produced nothing visible. These early incidents accumulated without any single one of them crossing the threshold that would have prompted the Shermans to take them seriously as evidence of something beyond the ordinary strangeness of a new property. Then the cattle started dying. The cattle mutilation cases that the Shermans documented across their time on the ranch have become the most widely cited element of their account, and for good reason. The precision of what was done to those animals, the excision of specific organs and tissue types, with a cleanliness that their veterinarian could not attribute to any known predator or conventional instrument, the absence of blood at or around the carcass in quantities consistent with the wounds present, the complete absence of tracks or other physical evidence of approach by whatever had produced the injuries, was not the kind of thing that ordinary ranch experience provided a framework for absorbing. Terry Sherman was not a man given to dramatic interpretation. He was a practical rancher whose professional default was to look for the most straightforward explanation for any problem his operation encountered. The mutilations did not have a straightforward explanation. The veterinary consultations he sought did not produce one, and the pattern of the mutilations, the consistency of what was targeted, the consistency of the surgical characteristics, the consistency of the absence of conventional evidence, across multiple separate incidents accumulating across months, ruled out the possibility that each case was an isolated event with its own independent explanation. The UFO sightings began during the same period as the mutilation cases and escalated in frequency and proximity across the Shermans' time on the property. Terry Sherman's accounts of what he observed in the sky above the ranch across his years on the property are consistent in their description of objects performing maneuvers that no conventional aircraft could execute. Direction changes at speeds that would be lethal for any known aerodynamic vehicle, acceleration from stationary to extreme velocity without any transitional period, objects disappearing from view instantaneously rather than moving out of the observable range. He observed these objects multiple times, under varied conditions, from varied positions on the property, in some cases at distances close enough that the conventional explanations available for distant aerial observations, satellites, aircraft, atmospheric optical phenomena, were not available. What he saw was close. It was physically real in the sense of occupying a definite position in the sky above his property, and it did not behave like anything he had encountered in a lifetime spent outdoors in the landscape of the American West. The most famous incident from the Sherman period, the account that has been repeated in every subsequent treatment of the ranch's history, is the bulletproof wolf encounter. Terry Sherman and a family member encountered a wolf-like animal on the property that they described as significantly larger than any wolf species whose range includes Utah, larger, they said, than any wolf they had seen in any context. The animal approached them without the behavioral characteristics of either a wild predator assessing prey or a domestic animal seeking interaction. It was calm, deliberate, and appeared to be communicating something through its behavior that neither of them could decode. When the animal took one of their calves in its jaws, Terry Sherman fired at it at close range with a rifle. The animal turned and looked at him. He fired again, and again, and again, multiple shots at close range from a rifle that was functioning correctly. He verified this afterward, produced no visible effect on the animal whatsoever, no reaction to impact, no blood, no behavioral change. The animal eventually walked away from them and simply disappeared into the landscape in a manner that neither Sherman nor anyone to whom they told the story has ever been able to account for. It did not run, it did not hide, it walked away and was not there. The poltergeist activity documented at the ranch house during the Sherman period adds a dimension to the account that distinguishes it from the pattern of purely external phenomenon. The aerial sightings, the mutilations, the strange animals that characterize many paranormal property cases. Objects inside the house moved. Objects disappeared from locked spaces and reappeared in locations that had been searched. The family reported a sustained and escalating pattern of domestic disturbance whose character, targeted, apparently intelligent, responsive to specific circumstances and specific family members, was inconsistent with the random disturbance of any conventional explanation the Shermans attempted to apply. The psychological toll of the domestic disturbance, layered on top of the external phenomenon they were experiencing and the financial cost of the cattle losses they were sustaining, produced a cumulative pressure on the family that Terry Sherman described in later interviews as having a quality of intentionality, as though whatever was producing the experiences was aware of the cumulative effect and was sustaining it deliberately. The crop circles documented on the property during the Sherman period have received less sustained attention in the subsequent literature than the mutilations and the aerial sightings, but they represent a category of physical trace evidence whose significance is not diminished by the relative inattention they have received. The formations found in the Sherman cattle fields were not simple circles. They were complex geometric arrangements whose regularity and precision were inconsistent with any mechanical explanation that the Shermans or the researchers who subsequently examined the sites could apply. They appeared without any evidence of the physical disturbance that mechanical production would require. No tracks in the surrounding field, no soil compaction outside the formation boundary, no evidence of the kind of human activity that would inevitably accompany the creation of formations of this scale and precision. They simply appeared, and their appearance, consistently located in specific areas of the property that subsequent investigation would identify as electromagnetic anomaly zones, was one of the first indications that the different categories of phenomenon the Shermans were documenting might be expressions of a single underlying source rather than independent events occurring in parallel on the same property. The Shermans sold the property to Robert Bigelow in 1996. Terry Sherman has described the decision in later interviews as having been driven not by any single incident, but by the accumulated weight of 20 months of sustained experience on a property that had demonstrated, through a catalog of phenomenon that no member of the family had any adequate explanation for, that it was not going to become the working ranch they had intended it to be. The practical dreams they had invested in the property were not achievable there. Whatever the land was, it was not available for the ordinary purposes they had brought to it. They left with their livestock, the cattle that had survived, and with an account of what they had experienced that they have been consistent about across every telling in the nearly 3 decades since. Robert Bigelow in 1996 was already one of the more unusual figures in the American business landscape, a Las Vegas real estate developer who had accumulated substantial wealth through the Budget Suites of America hotel chain and who had spent years privately funding research into consciousness, anomalous phenomenon, and what he described as the scientific questions that mainstream institutions were unwilling to address because the answers they might produce were too disruptive to the frameworks on which those institutions depended. His interest in Skinwalker Ranch was not a casual acquisition. It was a deliberate decision, made with full awareness of what the Sherman family had experienced there, to establish a dedicated research site for the systematic scientific investigation of exactly the class of phenomenon that the property had been producing. Bigelow paid approximately $200,000 for the property, a price the Shermans accepted, below what they might have obtained in an open market sale, because Bigelow's stated intention to investigate rather than simply develop the land was consistent with what they had come to feel the property deserved. The National Institute for Discovery Science, which Bigelow established and funded to conduct the research, assembled a team that was remarkable by the standards of paranormal investigation in the 1990s. Credentialed scientists, former military and intelligence professionals, and researchers with backgrounds in disciplines ranging from physics and biology to veterinary forensics and aerospace engineering, all brought together under a research framework designed to apply genuine scientific methodology to whatever the ranch produced. The physical infrastructure the NIDS team installed on the property was the most sophisticated continuous monitoring architecture ever deployed at a paranormal investigation site to that point. Cameras covering the property's most active areas ran continuously. Instrumentation measuring electromagnetic fields, radiation levels, audio across the full frequency range, and atmospheric conditions logged data around the clock. The research team maintained a permanent presence on the property in rotating shifts, ensuring that the investigation was never in a position of having missed something because no one was there. The methodological commitment was serious. The funding was adequate to support it, and the team was qualified to conduct the research it had been assembled to produce. What the NIDS investigation documented across its years on the property constitutes the most substantial body of systematically collected paranormal evidence produced at any single location in American research history up to that point. The aerial phenomenon continued to manifest. Objects tracked on multiple instruments simultaneously, observed by multiple trained researchers in conditions that eliminated the range of conventional explanations available for single witness accounts in ambiguous observational circumstances. The electromagnetic anomalies were mapped across the property with an instrument density that the Sherman family's observations had not permitted, producing a picture of the property's energy environment that revealed specific zones of concentrated field strength elevation whose pattern was inconsistent with any geological or atmospheric explanation the team could generate. The cattle mutilation cases continued, and the NIDS team's ability to respond to fresh cases with forensic specialists and laboratory resources produced analyses of the physical evidence that went significantly beyond what the Shermans had been able to obtain. One of the most significant incidents from the NIDS period, documented in the subsequent literature by multiple sources whose accounts are consistent, involved members of the scientific team directly witnessing the appearance and disappearance of structured light phenomenon in the sky above the mesa during a nighttime monitoring session. The accounts describe objects of apparent physical solidity internally illuminated, performing maneuvers in the airspace above the property that the observers, who included people with professional backgrounds in aerospace research, could not attribute to any known aircraft or atmospheric optical phenomenon. The objects were tracked on the monitoring instrumentation running during the session, and the instrument data was consistent with the observer accounts in a manner that eliminated the possibility that what was described was a shared perceptual anomaly rather than a documented physical event. The data from that session entered the NIDS archive, whether it subsequently entered the government's possession through the connections between Bigelow's research operation and the intelligence community that would become more apparent during the AAW-SAP period, is a question the available record does not answer definitively. The poltergeist activity documented during the NIDS period extended the Sherman family's experience with domestic disturbance on the property in a form that was arguably more evidentiary, because it was witnessed by scientific researchers rather than by a family whose accounts, however consistent and credible, were subject to the dismissal that personal witness testimony always faces when the content of the testimony is extraordinary. NIDS researchers documented instances of objects moving in the ranch house in the presence of multiple observers simultaneously. Equipment was affected in ways that the operators could not account for mechanically. Physical effects on researchers themselves, temperature changes, sensory disturbances, and in at least one documented case, a physiological response that required medical attention, were recorded across the investigation period in a pattern consistent with what the Sherman family had experienced and inconsistent with any conventional environmental explanation the team could identify. The NIDS investigation wound down in the early 2000s without producing a public report of its full findings. The data it collected, the instrument records, the photographic and video documentation, the laboratory analyses of physical evidence samples, entered an archive that Bigelow controlled and that has never been fully made public. What has entered the public record from the NIDS period has come primarily through the accounts of former team members, through the book that George Knapp co-authored with NIDS scientist Colm Kelleher, and through the portions of the NIDS research that were incorporated into the AAWSAP program that followed. What those partial disclosures communicate about the totality of the NIDS findings is a body of documented evidence that the scientific team found genuinely inexplicable and that the conventional scientific frameworks they brought to the investigation proved inadequate to contain. The scientific research teams that cycled through Skinwalker Ranch during the NIDS investigation period were visitors to the property. However extended their individual rotations, however committed they were to the investigation, they retained the option of leaving when their shift was over, of returning to homes and communities and professional lives that existed in a world where the ordinary rules of physical reality applied consistently. The families who lived on the ranch as caretakers and managers during the investigation period did not have that option. Their daily lives were organized entirely within the property's boundaries, and the catalog of phenomenon the research teams documented during investigation sessions was, for the resident families, simply the environment they inhabited continuously. The Gorman family, the name used in the published accounts to protect the actual family's identity, managed the ranch operation during a significant portion of the NIDS investigation period and produced an account of sustained residence on the property that adds a dimension to the documentary record that the session-based research visits could not generate. What the Gormans experienced was not a series of discrete anomalous events interspersed with periods of normalcy. It was a sustained and escalating immersion in an environment that produced anomalous phenomenon with a frequency and a pervasiveness that gradually dismantled the family's ability to maintain the ordinary psychological framework within which most people organize their relationship to the physical world. The aerial phenomenon that the research teams documented during nighttime monitoring sessions was, for the Gorman family, a routine feature of the night sky above their home. They watched objects perform maneuvers above the mesa on a regularity that the research team's scheduled observation sessions only partially captured. They observed the structured light phenomenon moving through the property's airspace in patterns that they came to recognize, and that produced in them not the acute response of a researcher encountering something extraordinary during a formal investigation session, but the chronic response of people living in close quarters with something they could never fully accommodate. The physical effects on the Gorman family members across their time on the property represent the most disturbing element of their account from a human well-being perspective. Family members reported health changes that their physicians could not attribute to identifiable causes. Psychological disturbances, sleep disruption, heightened anxiety, perceptual anomalies were consistent across multiple family members without any shared environmental cause that conventional medical assessment could identify. At least one family member required medical attention for a physical condition that appeared and resolved in a manner inconsistent with the normal progression of any diagnosis applied to it, and whose connection to specific activities on the property was direct enough that the family drew the conclusion independently. The cattle they managed suffered losses at rates that the research team documented systematically, but the experience of those losses for the Gorman family was not a data point in a scientific investigation. It was the destruction of animals they were responsible for and had relationships with, in circumstances they could not prevent or explain. The behavioral adaptations the Gorman family developed in response to what the ranch consistently produced are perhaps the most practically significant element of their account for anyone trying to understand what sustained residence on this property demands. They learned which areas of the property to avoid after dark. They learned which behaviors in specific zones seemed to provoke responses from whatever was monitoring the property, and which did not. They developed a practiced awareness of the environmental conditions, specific atmospheric states, specific times of day, specific combinations of factors that seemed to correlate with elevated activity levels on the property. This was not the formalized pattern recognition of a scientific investigation. It was the adaptive intelligence of people who had no choice but to develop a functional relationship with an environment that was actively hostile to their well-being in ways they could not fully understand. The Gorman family eventually left the property. The specific circumstances of their departure have not been fully documented in any public account. What is known from the partial accounts available is that the cumulative toll of sustained residence on the ranch, the physical effects, the psychological impact, the livestock losses, and the relentless presence of phenomenon that their framework for understanding the physical world was never adequate to absorb, produced in the family the same recognition that the Sherman family had reached before them. The land was not available for the ordinary purposes of human habitation. Whatever it was not doing it in a manner compatible with the ordinary requirements of a family life. They left, and the research continued without them. George Knapp's role in the public history of Skinwalker Ranch is not that of a researcher or an investigator in the scientific sense of those terms. It is the role of the journalist who understood what the story was before anyone else in the public domain had put the pieces together, and who had both the professional credibility and the personal commitment to bring it forward in a form that the public conversation about paranormal phenomenon could actually receive. Without Knapp, the Skinwalker Ranch story might have remained exactly what it was before his involvement. A body of privately held research findings, a family's unpublicized account, and a government program whose existence would not be publicly acknowledged for another decade. Knapp changed that, and the change he produced has shaped every subsequent development in the ranch's public history. Knapp was already one of the most respected investigative journalists in the Las Vegas media market when he first became aware of the Skinwalker Ranch story in the late 1990s. His prior investigative work had taken him into territory that most mainstream journalists avoided: the UFO phenomenon, the history of classified military programs in the Nevada desert, and the relationship between the government's acknowledged activities and the range of things happening in the airspace above the American West that the official record did not account for. That prior engagement with unconventional subject matter had given him both the background to understand the significance of what the Sherman family had experienced and the professional relationships that gave him access to sources within the research community, within the intelligence community adjacent to Bigelow's operation, and eventually within the NIDS investigation itself, that a journalist without his specific history in this territory would not have had. His initial contact with the Sherman family produced the first public account of their experience, a news report whose reception confirmed what Knapp had assessed about the story's significance. The public response to the Sherman account was substantial and serious in a way that distinguished it from the typical response to paranormal claims in the mainstream media. People recognized in the Sherman's description of their experience something that resonated with accounts they had heard from credible sources in their own lives, but that the public conversation had never provided an adequate vehicle for. The Sherman account, told through Knapp's reporting, gave that recognition a legitimate address. The publication of Hunt for the Skinwalker in 2005, co-authored with NIDS scientist Colm Kelleher, represented the first systematic public treatment of the full body of evidence the NIDS investigation had produced. The book was careful in its claims. Knapp and Kelleher presented what the research had documented without asserting conclusions that the evidence did not yet support. But the cumulative effect of the documented incidents assembled in sequence was more persuasive than any single claim about the ranch's significance could have been. Readers who came to the book skeptical about paranormal phenomenon generally left it with a different relationship to the question than they had arrived with, not because the book overclaimed, but because the documented record it assembled was extensive enough and internally consistent enough to make the dismissive response uncomfortable to maintain. Knapp's ongoing involvement in the Skinwalker Ranch story across the subsequent decades has given the public account of the ranch's history a continuity and a credibility that it would not otherwise have. He has been present at key moments in the ranch's public narrative: the AAWSAP disclosures, the History Channel broadcast deal, the UAP congressional hearings, in ways that reflect both his sustained personal investment in the story and his professional positioning as the journalist with the deepest established knowledge of its full history. His connection to Brandon Fugal's current investigation has given the broadcast series a journalistic credibility that the paranormal television genre has not historically been able to claim. And his continued reporting on the developments surrounding UAP disclosure at the governmental level has consistently provided context for the ranch's story within the broader institutional framework that has always been one of its most significant dimensions. The story of the United States government's classified investigation of Skinwalker Ranch is the most institutionally significant chapter in the property's documented history, and it is a story whose full dimensions are still not publicly known, more than a decade after the program's existence was first acknowledged. What has entered the public record about the Advanced Aerospace Weapon System Applications Program and its relationship to the ranch represents a partial accounting of a classified research initiative whose scope, findings, and implications for the official understanding of the phenomena documented at the ranch are substantially larger than anything the government has been willing to disclose. The AAWSAP program was established in 2007 under funding from the Defense Intelligence Agency channeled through a Pentagon budget allocation secured with the involvement of then-Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid of Nevada, a politician with a long-standing personal interest in UAP research whose connection to Robert Bigelow was both professional and personal. The program's official designation, Advanced Aerospace Weapon System Applications, was designed to suggest a conventional aerospace threat assessment function that would not attract scrutiny from oversight committees whose members were not among the small group of legislators and officials who understood its actual research agenda. The contract for the program's primary research work was awarded to Bigelow's aerospace company, Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, an arrangement that gave a private entity with the most extensive existing database of paranormal research in the country a classified government contract to continue and expand exactly the research it had been conducting independently through the NIDS program. Skinwalker Ranch was designated as the program's primary field research site from the beginning. The accumulated NIDS data on the property made it the most extensively pre-documented anomalous location available to the program, and the physical infrastructure already installed on the ranch gave the classified research operation a starting point that a program beginning from scratch could not have replicated in the time frame available. The AAWSAP researchers who arrived at the ranch did so with classification authority, with resources that substantially exceeded what the NIDS program had deployed, and with a mandate from the Defense Intelligence Agency that gave their investigation an institutional weight that private research had never been able to claim. What the AAWSAP researchers documented at the ranch across the program's operational period, from 2007 through 2012 when its funding was officially discontinued, has not been fully disclosed. The portions of the program's findings that have entered the public record have done so through three primary channels, none of which provides a complete accounting. The first is the voluntary disclosures of former program participants, most prominently Luis Elizondo, who served as the program's director in its later years, and James Lakatsky, who was the DIA analyst who initiated the program's establishment, and who has provided the most detailed public account of what the classified investigation found. Lakatsky's account, partially documented in the book Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, co-authored with Kelleher and Knapp, describes a research program that documented phenomenon at the ranch that went beyond the categories the NIDS investigation had established, and that produced findings that the program's leadership determined could not be made public without consequences that went beyond the normal parameters of classified information management. The second channel is the Freedom of Information disclosures that have partially surfaced the program's administrative record, budget documents, contract records, and program assessments whose unredacted portions provide evidence of the program's scope and its relationship to the ranch without revealing the substantive content of its research findings. The pattern of redaction in these documents is itself informative. The heaviest classification is applied consistently to the sections that would reveal what the program found, rather than to the sections that document its administrative structure or its budget, suggesting that it is the findings rather than the program's existence that remain the primary subject of classification concern. The third channel is the congressional attention that the program received beginning in 2017, when reporting by the New York Times and other outlets first brought its existence to broad public awareness and triggered a series of congressional hearings and intelligence community reviews that are still ongoing. The testimony provided during those hearings by former program participants, intelligence officials, and military personnel has added substantially to the public understanding of what the AAWSAP program investigated and what its participants believe about the significance of what they found, while stopping well short of the full disclosure that the program's findings appear to demand. What is known from these partial disclosures is that the AAWSAP investigation at Skinwalker Ranch documented phenomenon that its scientific team found genuinely beyond the explanatory reach of the conventional frameworks they brought to the investigation. The aerial phenomenon was documented on classified instruments whose sensitivity and specificity substantially exceeded the monitoring infrastructure the NIDS program had deployed. The underground anomalies beneath the mesa were assessed with classified geological survey technology that produced a picture of the subterranean environment below the ranch that the program's leadership found significant enough to restrict from the general research team. Physical effects on personnel operating on the property were documented medically and analyzed in ways that the NIDS program had not had the resources to pursue, and the pattern of the phenomenon's behavior, its apparent awareness of and responsiveness to investigation activity, its apparent calibration of output to the capability level of the instruments being deployed, and its sustained and consistent production of evidence that fell just beyond the threshold of definitive documentation, was assessed by the program's leadership in terms that went beyond any conventional threat assessment framework the Defense Intelligence Agency normally applied to its research programs. James Lakatsky has publicly described the experience that convinced him the phenomenon at Skinwalker Ranch warranted a classified government investigation. During an initial visit to the ranch facilitated by Bigelow, he witnessed something inside the ranch house, a specific physical object or entity whose nature he has declined to describe in detail in any public account, that he concluded could not have been produced by any human means and could not be explained within any conventional framework he possessed. That experience was the proximate cause of his decision to pursue the AAWSAP program's establishment. Whatever he saw in that ranch house on that initial visit has not been described publicly. What it produced was a classified government investigation of the most expensive and sustained kind. The implications of that proportionality are left for the audience to assess. Robert Bigelow held the Skinwalker Ranch property for approximately 2 decades after purchasing it from the Sherman family, during which time it served as the primary research site for both the NIDS investigation and the classified AAWSAP program. When Bigelow sold the property in 2016, the transaction received no public attention at the time. It was a private real estate sale in a rural Utah county that would not ordinarily generate coverage outside of local records. The buyer was Brandon Fugal, a Utah commercial real estate developer whose business success had made him one of the most prominent figures in the Intermountain West's property market, and whose interest in the ranch was, by his own account, both a business decision and a deeply personal one. Fugal's background is important context for understanding the character of the investigation he established at the ranch following his acquisition of the property. He is not a paranormal investigator. He is not a scientist. He is a businessman with the analytical instincts of someone who has built a substantial career on the ability to assess the realistic value of claims that others have made about property and opportunity. His decision to purchase Skinwalker Ranch was made with full access to the documented history of the property, the Sherman family account, the NIDS research, the portions of the AAWSAP program's existence that were beginning to enter public awareness through journalistic investigation, and with the understanding that what the property had consistently produced across that history was either the most significant paranormal evidence in American history or the most sustained and elaborate fabrication. His assessment was that the evidence was real and that it warranted the investment. The investigation framework Fugal established at the ranch following his acquisition was distinguished from its predecessors by several specific characteristics. The first was transparency. Fugal made the decision early that the investigation would be documented for public broadcast in a format that would bring independent scrutiny to the findings the research produced, and that would prevent the accumulation of privately held evidence that characterized both the NIDS investigation and the AAWSAP program. The History Channel broadcast agreement that produced the series Curse of Oak Island creator Kevin Burns brought to the project gave the investigation a production infrastructure and a distribution platform that no prior research program at the ranch had been able to access. The second distinguishing characteristic was the scientific credibility of the research team. The recruitment of Travis Taylor, a NASA scientist and defense researcher with a doctorate in optical science and engineering, a master's degree in physics, and a professional background that included work on directed energy weapons and advanced aerospace systems, as the investigation's chief scientist, gave the ranch's research program a level of institutional credibility that was unprecedented in the paranormal television space. Taylor was not a paranormal investigator who had acquired scientific training. He was a working scientist in a field directly relevant to the class of phenomenon the ranch was producing, who brought his professional methodology to an investigation whose subject matter he approached with genuine skepticism and whose evidence he followed with the professional discipline his training demanded. The third distinguishing characteristic was the technological capability Fugal deployed in the investigation. The monitoring infrastructure installed at the ranch under his ownership represented the current upper boundary of commercially and institutionally available technology in every category relevant to the investigation: electromagnetic measurement, acoustic monitoring, aerial surveillance, underground imaging, and physical evidence analysis. The gap between what the ranch was producing and what the instruments could capture, which had defined the entire prior history of the investigation, was narrowed more significantly in the first seasons of Fugal's investigation than in all the preceding years of research combined. The production team that assembled around the investigation to produce the broadcast series, the crew members who became familiar to the show's audience across multiple seasons as recurring figures in the ranch's ongoing story, brought to the property a diversity of background and expertise that the prior research programs had not matched. Engineers, geologists, military veterans, and medical professionals alongside the scientific team created an investigative capacity that was genuinely multidisciplinary in a way that the earlier programs, organized around narrower research mandates, had not been. The first two broadcast seasons of Curse of Skinwalker Ranch, which premiered on the History Channel in 2020, introduced the property and its phenomenon to an audience whose scale no prior investigation of the ranch had been able to reach. The production decision to document the investigation in real time, showing the research process as it unfolded rather than presenting polished findings after the fact, was both a television format choice and a methodological commitment. It meant that the audience watched the investigation's surprises as they occurred, including the moments when the evidence exceeded what the team had anticipated, and the moments when conventional explanations successfully accounted for what had initially appeared anomalous. The baseline documentation of the property's active zones that the first two seasons established, the electromagnetic profile of each area, the acoustic environment, the aerial observation record, and the physical effects on crew members in specific locations, provided a reference framework against which the escalating findings of subsequent seasons could be understood. The mesa was identified in the first season as the property's most consistently active zone, producing electromagnetic readings that exceeded normal variance at rates and to magnitudes that the investigation's instruments documented across multiple independent sessions. The Homestead Triangle, the area surrounding the original ranch house, was identified as a second zone of concentrated anomalous activity, whose specific characteristics differed from the mesa in ways that suggested different mechanisms producing different categories of phenomenon at different areas of the property. The aerial phenomenon documented during the first two seasons ranged from the ambiguous lights in the night sky that could have had conventional explanations to the definitively unexplained objects tracked simultaneously on multiple independent instruments performing maneuvers that the team's aerospace-credentialed members found impossible to attribute to any known aircraft. Travis Taylor's instrument data from the aerial tracking sessions produced records that he described on camera with the careful language of a scientist who understood both the significance of what the measurements showed and the professional implications of overstating a finding before the verification process was complete. His restraint in those descriptions is itself informative. It communicates the discipline of a researcher who knows what he is looking at and is choosing his words accordingly. The physical effects on crew members documented in the first two seasons established a pattern that would deepen across subsequent seasons and that gave the investigation one of its most humanly compelling evidential threads. Multiple crew members experienced physiological responses, headaches, disorientation, nausea, and in some cases more acute medical symptoms, in specific zones of the property that appeared to correlate with elevated instrument readings in those zones. The medical documentation of these effects, conducted with the rigor that Travis Taylor's scientific framework demanded, produced a body of health data that was consistent across independent individuals without a shared conventional cause, and that connected directly to the specific locations and environmental conditions the investigation had identified as anomalous. The equipment failures documented during the first two seasons were among the most immediately striking evidence the broadcast format captured because they occurred on camera in conditions that made post-production fabrication implausible. Camera systems, electronic instruments, and communications equipment failed at rates and in patterns that the production team's technical staff found impossible to attribute to normal equipment behavior. The failures were consistent with the electromagnetic anomalies the instruments documented in the relevant zones, concentrated in specific areas, correlated with specific environmental conditions, and recurring across multiple independent pieces of equipment in patterns that the technical team noted and documented as systematically anomalous. The first two seasons also established the character of Brandon Fugal's approach to the investigation in a way that shaped the audience's relationship to the evidence the show produced. His combination of genuine skepticism, his insistence on pursuing conventional explanations before entertaining unconventional ones, and genuine open-mindedness, his willingness to follow the evidence wherever it led regardless of the implications, gave the investigation a credibility that the audience recognized and responded to. He was not a true believer performing curiosity. He was a businessman performing rigorous assessment, and the assessment was consistently producing results that his rigor could not conventionally explain. The third and fourth seasons of the broadcast investigation introduced a dimension to the Skinwalker Ranch story that transformed the analytical framework of the entire prior research record: the underground. While the aerial phenomenon and the electromagnetic anomalies documented in the first two seasons had established the ranch as an extraordinary location by any investigative standard, they remained in a fundamental sense the surface of whatever the property represented. The discovery that the most significant dimension of the ranch's phenomenon might be operating beneath the ground rather than above it shifted the investigation's entire orientation and connected the surface and aerial evidence to a physical infrastructure whose existence had been hinted at in the prior research record without ever being directly addressed. The deep sonar work conducted in Season 3 was the pivot point. The sonar equipment deployed at the mesa returned images of the underground environment beneath the property that the geologist consulting on the investigation described with a visible effort at professional composure that the broadcast cameras captured with the intimacy that real-time documentation produces. The voids identified beneath the mesa were not the kind of formations that the geological profile of the Uinta Basin would predict. Their geometry was too consistent, their arrangement too regular, and their depth profile too specific to be accounted for by the natural processes of dissolution and erosion that produce cave systems in comparable geological environments. Something had been there before the geological record the visible surface represented. The ground-penetrating radar work that expanded on the sonar findings produced a more detailed picture of the underground formation beneath the mesa, a picture that confirmed the structured character of the voids and added a spatial organization to the underground map that the sonar imagery alone had not fully resolved. The formations were connected. They were not isolated voids scattered randomly through the subsurface geology. They were linked in a pattern whose organization the investigation's technical team found consistent with a constructed rather than a naturally formed underground system, a distinction whose implications the broadcast coverage treated with appropriate weight. The drilling operation that attempted to physically access what the sonar and radar had identified ran into the resistance that has characterized every attempt to penetrate the underground structures beneath the mesa across every investigation program that has tried. Equipment that functioned correctly in other drilling contexts failed at specific depths beneath the mesa in patterns too consistent across multiple attempts to be attributed to random mechanical failure. The specific depths at which the failures occurred corresponded to the upper boundaries of the void structures the sonar had identified, a correspondence that the investigation team noted as indicating that whatever was beneath the mesa was not indifferent to the drilling operation attempting to reach it. Something down there was responding. The drilling was not reaching what it was aimed at, and the way it was failing was telling the investigation something about the nature of what it had not yet reached. The underground investigation introduced in Seasons 3 and 4 also connected the ranch's evidence to the broader Uinta Basin context in a way that the aerial and electromagnetic evidence had not. The geological surveys of the basin that the investigation consulted as context for the mesa findings revealed that the underground anomalies detected beneath the ranch were not isolated to the ranch's specific footprint. The formation extended. Its lateral reach, as suggested by the available geological data, pointed toward adjacent properties and eventually toward the broader basin geography in a manner that established the ranch not as the location of an anomalous underground feature, but as one documented point on a subsurface structure of potentially basin-wide extent. That reframing, from an anomalous ranch to a data point in a regional underground system, was the most significant analytical shift the investigation produced in its first 4 seasons. The mesa at the center of Skinwalker Ranch is a flat-topped geological formation rising approximately 10 to 15 meters above the surrounding terrain, covering an area whose precise dimensions have been documented across multiple investigation programs without that documentation ever fully accounting for what makes it the most anomalously active specific feature on the most anomalously active property in American paranormal research history. It is not visually dramatic in the way that some landscape features associated with paranormal activity are dramatic. It does not look like a place where extraordinary things happen. It looks like what it is, an elevated patch of high desert terrain on a working ranch in rural Utah. What makes it significant is everything the instruments and the observers who have spent time in its vicinity have documented about it across the entire span of the ranch's investigation history. The aerial phenomenon associated with the mesa has been documented by every investigation program that has engaged with the property. The Sherman family's accounts place the most dramatic of their UAP sightings directly above the mesa formation. The NIDS research team's most significant aerial documentation sessions were conducted from observation positions with clear sightlines to the mesa's airspace. The AAWSAP investigation's classified aerial tracking data, the portions that have been referenced in the partial public disclosures from that program, is described by former participants as concentrated above and in the immediate vicinity of the mesa, and the broadcast investigation's aerial documentation across its seasons consistently shows the mesa as the location above which the most unexplained aerial activity is concentrated. The electromagnetic anomalies associated with the mesa have been documented with sufficient precision across the current investigation to establish a specific profile. Readings that exceed the normal variance for the region by measurable margins, concentrated in the zone immediately around and above the mesa formation, correlated with the documented aerial activity in a manner that suggests the electromagnetic environment and the aerial phenomenon are not independent features of the mesa's activity but components of the same system. Travis Taylor's repeated references in the broadcast investigation to the relationship between the electromagnetic readings and the aerial observations reflect his scientific assessment that the mesa is not simply a location where two different categories of anomalous phenomenon happen to occur in proximity, but a location where a single underlying process is expressing itself in two different detectable forms. The physical effects on investigators documented in the mesa vicinity across the ranch's investigation history constitute a body of medical and physiological evidence that is among the most disturbing elements of the property's record. The pattern, concentrated in specific zones of the mesa and its immediate surroundings, correlated with elevated instrument readings in those zones, consistent across multiple independent individuals in a way that rules out psychological suggestion as the primary driver, indicates that the mesa's electromagnetic environment is physiologically active in a manner that goes beyond the ordinary effects of elevated field strength on human tissue. Investigators across every research program that has worked in the mesa zone have documented symptoms that their attending physicians could not attribute to any conventional cause, and that resolved upon leaving the property in a pattern consistent with environmental rather than medical etiology. The underground structures identified beneath the mesa formation represent the dimension of its anomalous character that the current investigation has engaged with most directly, and that has produced the most significant recent findings in the ranch's documented history. The sonar and ground-penetrating radar work that established the existence of structured voids beneath the mesa placed the physical substrate of whatever is producing the mesa's surface and aerial phenomenon in a location that the drilling operation is attempting to access directly. The resistance the drilling has encountered at specific depths, correlated with the boundaries of the underground void structures the imaging has identified, indicates that the mesa is not simply sitting above an anomalous geological feature. It appears to be sitting above something that knows it is there. The full catalog of mesa-specific incidents across the ranch's documented history, the Sherman family's sightings, the NIDS team's observations, the AAWSAP investigation's classified documentation, and the current broadcast investigation's accumulating record, represents the single most substantial body of concentrated anomalous evidence associated with any specific geographic feature in the history of American paranormal research. Whatever the mesa is, it is the center of whatever Skinwalker Ranch is, and whatever Skinwalker Ranch is, the mesa is where the answer lives. The cattle mutilation cases documented at Skinwalker Ranch across its investigation history represent the category of physical evidence that is simultaneously the most concretely documented and the most difficult to engage with emotionally, because it involves the deaths of animals in circumstances whose characteristics are disturbing precisely because they are so specifically inexplicable. These are not cases where ambiguity about what happened produces ambiguity about whether something unusual occurred. The surgical precision, the absence of blood, the specific targeting of particular organs and tissue types, and the physical condition of the surrounding scene all point unambiguously toward an agent capable of producing results that no known predator or conventional instrument can replicate. The mutilation cases are the hardest evidence in the Skinwalker Ranch record, the physical trace evidence category that most directly demands an explanation and most consistently resists every explanation offered. The Sherman family documented the first mutilation cases at the ranch within weeks of their arrival in 1994. The pattern they established, cattle found dead in the field with specific organs and tissue types removed with a precision their veterinarian described as surgical, no blood present at or around the carcass, no tracks or other physical evidence of an approach by whatever had produced the injuries, and the surrounding herd exhibiting sustained behavioral disturbance in the vicinity of the carcass, has remained consistent across every subsequent mutilation case documented at the ranch across 3 decades of investigation. The consistency of that pattern across cases separated by years and investigated by different teams with different methodologies is one of the most significant features of the mutilation evidence as a body of evidence. It points toward a source that operates the same way every time, regardless of the specific circumstances. The veterinary forensic analyses conducted on fresh mutilation cases during the NIDS investigation period added technical precision to the description of what the mutilations involved. The excisions were performed with an instrument whose cutting characteristics, the absence of tearing, the cauterized quality of the wound margins, the precision of the tissue boundary, do not match any conventional cutting instrument in standard use. The absence of blood both within the wound cavity and in the surrounding scene is inconsistent with any mechanism of death or injury whose effects on a living animal's circulatory system would allow the body's blood volume to be removed without leaving trace evidence of the removal process. Whatever removed the blood from those animals did so without leaving a record of how it was done. That absence of evidence for the process is as significant as the evidence of the result. The specific organs and tissue types consistently targeted across the Skinwalker Ranch mutilation cases, the eyes, the lips and facial tissue, the genitalia, the rectum, and specific internal organs whose removal requires access through body cavities, have been noted by researchers who have examined the full history of cattle mutilation cases across the American West as consistent with a pattern that transcends geographic and temporal boundaries. The same organs, the same tissue types, the same surgical characteristics appear in mutilation cases documented from Florida to Alberta, from the 1970s to the present day. The pattern is too specific and too consistent across too many independent cases to be the product of independent coincidence. It indicates a single operational source applying the same methodology across a geographic range and a time span that no conventional explanation, no human perpetrator, no known predator can account for. The current investigation's engagement with mutilation cases that have occurred on the property since Fugal's acquisition has added the most sophisticated forensic analysis yet applied to fresh cases at the ranch. The laboratory resources available to the investigation, combined with the ability to respond to fresh cases with forensic specialists before the physical evidence has degraded, have produced analyses of the wound characteristics, the tissue margins, and the surrounding physical environment that go substantially beyond what prior investigations were able to achieve. What those analyses have established, and what the investigation's scientific team has been careful about how to characterize publicly, is that the cutting mechanism used in the ranch's most recent mutilation cases is not consistent with any instrument in the forensic literature for sharp force injuries to animal tissue. The wounds are real. The instrument that produced them is not in any database of known cutting tools. Travis Taylor arrived at Skinwalker Ranch in the first season of the broadcast investigation as a credentialed skeptic. His academic training, a doctorate in optical science and engineering, master's degrees in physics and aerospace engineering, a professional career that included classified defense research and collaboration with NASA programs, had given him the most rigorous scientific methodology of anyone who had engaged with the ranch's phenomenon at any point in its documented history. His default position on paranormal claims was the position of a working scientist trained in the physical sciences, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that the evidence available for most paranormal phenomenon does not meet that standard. He brought that position to the ranch and applied it consistently across his early seasons of investigation. What the ranch produced in response to his methodology is the central dramatic arc of the broadcast investigation and the most significant scientific testimony in the ranch's modern history. The evolution of Taylor's position across the broadcast investigation seasons is documented in the show in a form that is more evidentiary than any single incident he could describe, because it is the accumulated record of a trained scientist's incremental confrontation with evidence that his training prepared him to evaluate, but did not prepare him to encounter. The early seasons show Taylor proposing and testing conventional explanations for anomalous readings, ruling out equipment artifacts, atmospheric effects, geological processes, and human causes with the systematic thoroughness that his methodology demanded. The middle seasons show him reaching for conventional explanations that are increasingly strained, still applying his methodology, but visibly aware that the conventional explanations are failing to account for the full body of evidence the investigation is producing. The later seasons show a scientist who has followed his evidence to a destination he did not choose, and who is managing the professional and personal implications of occupying that destination with the same disciplined honesty he brought to the investigation at the beginning. The specific incidents that Taylor has identified as the most significant in his personal experience at the ranch are worth noting because they represent the evidence that moved a trained physicist from skepticism to something that his professional caution prevents him from describing as belief, but that the behavioral record of his engagement with the investigation communicates unmistakably. The underground signal data, the structured electromagnetic readings from beneath the mesa that Taylor has described as having the characteristics of a signal rather than background noise, is the finding he has been most careful about in his public statements and most clearly affected by in his visible behavior during the investigation sessions when it is discussed. His response to that data is not the response of a scientist encountering ambiguous evidence. It is the response of a scientist who knows what he is looking at and is deciding how to say it. Taylor's willingness to follow the evidence publicly, to allow his evolution from skeptic to something more complex to be documented on camera in real time, is professionally courageous in a way that the paranormal television format rarely produces. Most scientists who engage with paranormal evidence either maintain a skeptical position that the evidence does not support or retreat from public engagement when the evidence pushes them beyond their professional comfort zone. Taylor has done neither. He has stayed on camera, continued applying his methodology, and allowed the record of where that methodology has led him to speak for itself. What it has said across the seasons of the broadcast investigation is that whatever is producing the evidence at Skinwalker Ranch is real, is physically active, and is operating in ways that the current state of human scientific understanding is not adequate to explain. The AAWSAP program's official funding period ended in 2012. But the institutional interest in Skinwalker Ranch that produced the program has never ended. The evidence for continuing governmental engagement with the ranch and with the broader phenomenon it represents, in the period since the AAWSAP program's formal conclusion, comes from multiple independent sources whose accounts converge on the same conclusion despite their independence from each other. The government did not stop caring about what Skinwalker Ranch was producing when the AAWSAP contract expired. It adjusted the form of its engagement while maintaining its substantive interest. The congressional attention that the AAWSAP program received beginning in 2017, when the New York Times reporting first brought it to broad public awareness, produced a series of hearings and intelligence community reviews that are still generating new public information about the program's scope and findings. The testimony provided in those hearings by former AAWSAP participants, by military personnel who encountered the phenomenon the program was investigating, and by intelligence officials whose institutional roles gave them access to the classified record, has collectively established that the government's engagement with Skinwalker Ranch and the class of phenomenon it represents is not a historical curiosity, but an active and ongoing institutional priority. The pattern of officially unidentified individuals visiting the current investigation at Skinwalker Ranch, people whose institutional affiliations have not been disclosed publicly, but whose professional backgrounds, as assessed by the investigation team, are clearly connected to government programs operating in the relevant space, is documented in the broadcast investigation in a manner that the production treated carefully but could not entirely obscure. The visits are real, the visitors are real, and the interests they represent, coming from institutions that have maintained their own classified record of the ranch's phenomenon for decades, is not casual. The UAP disclosure conversation that has been developing in the public domain since 2017, driven by the AAWSAP disclosures, the Navy pilot testimonies, the congressional hearings, and the intelligence community assessments that have partially entered the public record, places Skinwalker Ranch at the center of an institutional history whose scope is only now beginning to be visible from the outside. The ranch was not simply one site among many that the government investigated. It was the primary site, the location around which the most significant classified research program in the history of American UAP investigation was organized. What that program found there, what the people who ran it have been saying privately since it concluded, and what the continuing institutional engagement with the property reflects about the government's assessment of what it represents are questions that the current disclosure environment is slowly and incompletely beginning to answer. The framework within which Skinwalker Ranch is most commonly discussed, as a single anomalous property whose extraordinary history distinguishes it from the surrounding landscape, is, based on the accumulated evidence, the wrong framework. Skinwalker Ranch is not anomalous relative to the Uinta Basin. The Uinta Basin is anomalous, and Skinwalker Ranch is its most intensively documented and most publicly discussed point of access. The evidence for this reframing comes from every direction simultaneously, from the geological surveys that have identified underground anomalies distributed across the basin's geography, from the pattern of UAP activity documented across the basin's airspace, from the independent investigation of adjacent properties that have produced evidence of the same categories of phenomenon, and from the indigenous traditions that have consistently described the entire basin as a place of threshold rather than designating specific points within it as the source of what the basin produces. Blind Frog Ranch, located less than 15 miles from Skinwalker Ranch within the same basin, has produced in its documented investigation history a catalog of anomalous evidence whose correspondences with the Skinwalker Ranch record are too specific to be coincidental. The underground chamber accessed by the Blind Frog excavation team, with its geometric consistency, its treated wall surfaces, and its structured contents, represents the first direct physical access to the underground infrastructure that the Skinwalker Ranch investigation has been detecting with sonar and radar without being able to reach directly. Two ranches, separated by 15 miles of basin floor, sitting above underground structures whose characteristics correspond in ways that the chance distribution of independent geological anomalies does not produce. The UAP activity documented above the Uinta Basin as a whole, by military personnel operating in the region, by civilian observers across the basin's populated areas, and by the research programs that have deployed systematic aerial monitoring at specific properties within the basin, shows a pattern of geographic concentration that the single property investigation framework cannot account for. The objects documented above Skinwalker Ranch are not confined to the ranch's airspace. The same classes of phenomenon, exhibiting the same behavioral characteristics, appear in the documented record across the broader basin in a distribution that is consistent with a basin-wide operational presence rather than a property-specific one. The Ute traditions about the Uinta Basin as a whole, the description of the entire basin as a place of threshold, the behavioral protocols maintained about specific areas across the basin rather than about a single point within it, and the generations of accumulated observation that produced those traditions, provide a cultural and historical corroboration of the physical evidence for the basin-wide nature of the phenomenon that no government program and no private investigation has yet engaged with seriously enough. The people who have known this land the longest have been describing a basin, not a ranch. The evidence produced by every investigation that has engaged with that basin seriously enough to look beyond its own specific research site has been confirming their description. The complete catalog of unexplained incidents documented at Skinwalker Ranch across its investigation history is too extensive to be treated exhaustively in any single presentation. What follows is a selection of the incidents that the cumulative research literature identifies as the most significant, the cases whose evidential quality, whose witness credibility, and whose resistance to conventional explanation make them the cornerstones of the argument that something genuinely extraordinary is operating at this property. The bulletproof wolf encounter documented by the Sherman family in 1994 remains, nearly 3 decades later, one of the most striking individual incidents in the ranch's documented history. Not because it is the most dramatically extraordinary, the catalog contains incidents that are in some ways more extreme, but because the specific nature of what it demonstrated is so concretely documented and so specifically inexplicable. Multiple shots from a functioning rifle at close range producing no effect on a physical animal that subsequently walked away and disappeared is not ambiguous. It does not have a conventional explanation. And the witness, a working rancher whose professional credibility was rooted in practical, empirical engagement with the physical world, is not the kind of source whose account invites the dismissal that paranormal testimony typically receives. The poltergeist activity witnessed by NIDS scientists during the investigation period crosses the most important evidential threshold in paranormal research, The presence of trained scientific observers who had no prior investment in confirming the phenomenon and who documented what they witnessed with the professional rigor their backgrounds demanded. The specific incidents, objects moving in the presence of multiple observers, equipment affected in ways that the operators could not account for mechanically, physical disturbances occurring in response to specific stimuli in a manner consistent with intentional rather than random production, were documented with the thoroughness that the NIDS investigation framework required. They are not anecdotal. They are the observed and recorded experience of credentialed researchers conducting organized scientific investigation. The structured light phenomenon documented above the mesa across multiple research programs represents the most consistently documented category of aerial evidence in the ranch's history. The objects described across the Sherman accounts, the NIDS observation records, and the current broadcast investigation share specific characteristics: internal illumination suggesting an energy source, structured form suggesting physical solidity, maneuverability characteristics that are inconsistent with any known aircraft or atmospheric optical phenomenon that persist across independent observations separated by years and produced by observers with no mechanism for coordination. The instrument data from the current investigation that correlates with the aerial observation record, electromagnetic readings that spike in the mesa's airspace during documented object sightings, acoustic signatures that match the frequency range of reported propulsion sounds, gives the current investigation's aerial documentation a physical corroboration that the prior observation record could not claim. The crew medical incidents from the current broadcast investigation represent the most recent and most medically documented category of physical effects on human observers at the ranch. The pattern, physiological responses concentrated in specific zones of the property, correlated with elevated instrument readings in those zones, consistent across independent individuals in a manner that rules out psychological suggestion, has been medically documented with the rigor that Travis Taylor's scientific framework demands. The individuals who have experienced these effects have been examined by physicians whose assessments, documented in the investigation's medical record, consistently find no conventional cause for the symptoms presented. What the ranch is doing to the people who spend time in its active zones is real, is physiologically measurable, and is not explained by any mechanism that the current state of medical science provides. The underground signal data from the most recent investigation seasons is the category of evidence that the investigation's scientific team has treated with the most careful public language and the most visible private concern. The structured electromagnetic readings from beneath the mesa, characterized by Travis Taylor in the broadcast with the restrained language of a scientist who knows the implications of his description, represent the first direct evidence that whatever is operating beneath the surface of the ranch is actively communicating through the medium of the electromagnetic environment above it. The signal is there. It is structured. It responds to the drilling operation. And it has been building in intensity across the most recent investigation sessions in a direction that is not random. The Skinwalker Ranch investigation, across its entire documented history from the Sherman family's arrival through the current broadcast seasons, has been organized around a set of questions that the accumulated evidence has narrowed without closing. These are not failures of the investigation. They are the specific shape of what the ranch has consistently refused to fully reveal. And that shape is itself informative about the nature of what is being protected. What is underneath the mesa is the question that the current investigation is closest to answering and furthest from having answered. The sonar and radar work has established that something is there. The drilling operation has demonstrated that reaching it directly is being resisted. The electromagnetic signal data has established that it is active and responsive, but the chamber or network of chambers that the underground imaging has identified has not been physically accessed. The thing beneath the mesa remains beneath the mesa, and every investigation that has tried to reach it has been stopped by the same combination of mechanical failure and geological resistance at the same depths. The shape of that resistance is the most specific communication the ranch has produced about what it is protecting. What the aerial phenomenon is and where it originates is a question that the documented observation record has characterized exhaustively without resolving. The objects documented above the mesa across 3 decades of investigation are real. They are tracked on instruments, observed by credentialed witnesses, and correlated with physical effects that rule out purely optical or perceptual explanations. What they are their origin, their propulsion mechanism, their purpose relative to the ranch and the basin, remains outside the explanatory reach of every conventional framework that has been applied to them. What the government found during the AAWSAP investigation that has never been disclosed is perhaps the most consequential unanswered question in the ranch's history, because the answer exists. It is in a classified archive somewhere in the government's possession, and the pattern of decisions around its non-disclosure communicates that it is being protected for reasons that go beyond the ordinary parameters of national security classification, what James Lakatsky saw in the ranch house on his initial visit, what the classified aerial tracking data from the AAWSAP period documented above the mesa, what the restricted geographic assessment of the basin identified in the section corresponding to the approach vector that the perimeter cameras have recently begun detecting. These are specific answers to specific questions that someone in the government's institutional structure knows. The fact that they have not been shared with any public investigation program is itself the most significant thing the government has communicated about what those answers contain. The Skinwalker Ranch investigation as it stands in its current season is operating at a level of technological capability, scientific credibility, and accumulated contextual knowledge that no prior research program at the property has been able to match. The seasons of documented research that preceded the current phase have produced a comprehensive baseline against which new findings can be assessed, a detailed map of the property's active zones, and a body of evidence in every category of the ranch's documented phenomenon that gives the current investigation a starting point that the Sherman family, the NIDS team, and even the classified AAWSAP program were not able to deploy. The underground investigation is the current season's primary focus, and the specific direction it is pursuing reflects the accumulated evidence of the prior seasons rather than the preliminary assessment of a program beginning from scratch. The drilling operation is targeting entry points that the sonar and radar mapping has identified as the most viable pathways to the underground void network beneath the mesa. Approach angles whose geological characteristics offer more favorable conditions for sustained penetration than the direct vertical approaches that prior drilling attempts have taken. The resistance those prior attempts encountered has informed the current strategy in a manner that reflects the investigation's understanding of how the ranch responds to approaches to its underground structures. The aerial surveillance infrastructure deployed in the current season represents the most comprehensive monitoring of the ranch's airspace ever achieved. The combination of visible light, infrared, and radar-based tracking systems running continuously across the mesa's airspace gives the current investigation a documentation capability for the aerial phenomenon that the prior observation record, dependent on the presence of observers during active sessions, could not achieve. What that continuous monitoring has been capturing in the most recent investigation period is information whose specifics are not fully in the public domain, but whose general character, an escalation in the frequency and the proximity of documented aerial activity above the mesa correlated with the current season's approach to the underground structures, is consistent with the pattern the entire investigation history has established of the ranch responding to investigation activity with calibrated increases in its own output. Brandon Fugal's and Travis Taylor's most recent public statements about the investigation reflect a quality of controlled urgency that has not been present in their earlier communications about the ranch. Both men are choosing their words with care that goes beyond the professional caution of prior seasons. What those words are communicating, to anyone who has followed the investigation closely enough to read the space between what is being said and what is being implied, is that the current season is producing evidence that the prior seasons were building toward, evidence whose specific character they are managing with awareness of what its full public disclosure would require, and of whether the world is ready to receive it. The complete history of Skinwalker Ranch, from the ancient Ute traditions that predate Western contact to the structured electromagnetic signal building beneath the mesa in the current investigation season, is not a collection of strange stories about a piece of Utah real estate. It is a single, continuous, multi-generational record of something operating in the Uinta Basin that has been producing the same categories of evidence, resisting the same categories of conventional explanation, and attracting the same quality of institutional attention for longer than any living person has been keeping records. The consistency of that record across independent observers, separated by decades of time and profound differences in background, methodology, cultural framework, and institutional affiliation, is the most important single fact the history produces. The Ute traditions describing a place of threshold, the 19th century settler accounts of livestock losses and aerial phenomenon, the Sherman family's 20 months of sustained first-hand documentation, the NIDS scientific investigation, the Pentagon's classified research program, the current broadcast investigation with its aerospace-credentialed scientist and its continuous monitoring infrastructure. Every one of these is an independent voice, operating from a different position in time and institutional space, producing a consistent account of what this land does and what it refuses to explain about itself. That consistency does not prove any specific claim about the nature of what is operating at Skinwalker Ranch. It does not tell us whether what is underneath the mesa is extraterrestrial, interdimensional, ancient, or something whose category the current state of human thought has not yet developed an adequate name for. What it tells us, what 3 decades of organized investigation and a much longer prior record collectively establish beyond any reasonable challenge, is that something real is there, something physically present, instrument detectable, physiologically active, and apparently aware of the investigations attempting to reach it. Something that has been operating in this landscape since before the first Western settler arrived, and that will be operating here long after the current investigation's cameras are packed away. Every investigator who has ever engaged seriously with the ranch's evidence has left the property with more questions than they arrived with. Every program that has tried to close the case, to produce the definitive finding that resolves the question of what Skinwalker Ranch is, has produced instead a deeper appreciation of how far the question extends beyond the reach of any single investigation's capability. The NIDS team produced a research archive whose full implications nobody has been willing to disclose. The AAWSAP program produced classified findings that have been protected from public access for over a decade by people whose decisions about what the public can be told reflect their assessment of what those findings contain. The current investigation is producing evidence whose character the people closest to it are managing with a visible awareness of consequence that no prior investigation of the property has exhibited as openly. Skinwalker Ranch is still there, the phenomenon is still active, the signal beneath the mesa is still building, the drilling operation is still trying to reach what the sonar has mapped, the cameras are still running, and the question that the entire history of this property has been asking, the question that the Ute traditions described, that the Sherman family lived, that the government classified, and that Travis Taylor has been following with the methodology of a physicist and the honesty of a man who knows what he is looking at, is closer to its answer than it has ever been. When that answer finally surfaces, it will not surprise anyone who has followed this history carefully enough to understand what it has been saying all along. It will simply be the moment when what the ranch has always known becomes something the world can no longer avoid knowing with it.